Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. Um, this conversation is more of a experiment than anything. Um, I've been telling my co-host here that I've been kind of retreating from politics to a certain degree, because, well, for various reasons. Partly, um, kind of fed up with certain aspects of internet culture around politics, partly because I've been questioning certain intuitions that I have, or intuitions that other people around me have. Um, Kind of thinking of trying to get back to the basics and really kind of nail down, well, what do I like, my basic beliefs, and then of course you can build up from there. Um, and then there's also questions about like why talk about politics at all, or why have political opinions. What does that mean? Is it worthwhile, or are we just talking about politics purely, um, just to talk about politics? Is it just purely like oh, we just like doing it, therefore we do it? Or is there some grander meaning to it, or should there be some grander meaning to it? Um, So that's just a whole collection of tangentially related thoughts. Um, would you like me to say a little more, or does that give you a good jumping off point for the conversation?
I think you can add a little bit more because I don't want to derail it before you even get out some of your thoughts about why I guess you're investigating your ideas more and maybe some of your value statements.
Okay.
Um, but don't say too much because or else you're going to throw out eight things and then we're going to go sideways and try to bounce eight conversations.
I'll do my best. So, I mean, I think it might be helpful to think about, or to talk a little bit about, kind of, I guess, my introduction to politics, which we talked about somewhat in the very first episode of this podcast. Um, well, if anyone doesn't know, or anyone hasn't listened to that podcast, I think it was around middle school that I became kind of politically aware. And of course, when I was in middle school, all I was doing was justifying my family's political opinions. So obviously, I wouldn't believe. I don't have the same worldview at 21 that I did at 13, 14. And then, of course, I started to absorb, or I started to watch a lot of political YouTubers, started reading a lot of articles. For a while, I was very attuned to the news. Um, and my thought kind of evolved from just standard Democrat talking points to um, more to left wing, but critical of the left wing establishment, critical of the Democrats. Um, so I don't know if I've moved that far away from that mindset, but I'm just not really satisfied with, I guess, maybe the way I'm engaging with political discussion, or the way I'm thinking about political questions, um, which is why I've been paying less attention to the news. Because if you just pay attention to the news, sometimes it can be almost too hard to think about politics when you're just focused on, oh, this commentator said this commentator said that, this news story happened on, was run on the front page of the New York Times, and you can be so inundated with information that your mind kind of doesn't know where to start. Um, and as everyone knows, I mean, a lot of political discourse is pretty worthless. And a lot of what politicians say is not really of any substance. A lot of what journalists say is not of any substance. Matt here linked me to an article about Barack Obama's memoir, where it was basically saying that it was a worthless book. I mean, it was worthless in the sense that Obama's whole shtick of hope and change was a facade. There was no hope and there was no change. Um, which I probably could have told him before even reading the reading the article. So I just need to think. I'm trying to use this episode to think more about these questions, and maybe you can like shed some light or just give some interesting thoughts, which might lead to other thoughts.
I have a lot of sympathies with what you're saying, because I think a lot of the reasons why I reached out to you about doing this podcast, a few years ago, and the reason why I've kind of done my own solo show a little bit, are because of the things you're laying out. One of the reasons why I wanted to do the show that we show up every week and do is because we actually are having a conversation that is above the 3-minute segments on CNN, right? We're trying to do the opposite of the host, far left person, far right person. And I use those in like the way that they would use them on CNN. And by that, I don't mean like really far left, but I mean like staunch Republican, staunch Democrat. What are your talking points go? And then that's kind of like the whole goal here is when we talk about things, we did episodes on positive and negative rights, and we kind of felt out positions on it. And even though I come from almost the right wing side in our paradigm, even though I'm an anarchist, I think you could draw some lines from the right, because that's where I originate from. So that's why we've been able to have some arguments about things that are more fun to talk about, like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson's debate, where I'm able to have more sympathies with things I don't really even believe in, but Jordan Peterson's kind of preaching. But then since like maybe, we're both pretty anti-war, so then we spin it around and I'm like, okay, but how do you feel about Sam Harris's view when he talks about Islam? And a lot of these things track with what neocons will argue. So we've been able to have these conversations that even though we're young guys and we're not the most, we're not the most well-read, sophisticated people, but to some extent, we've always strived to be beyond that low level of discourse. That's a lot of inspiration for what we do. Now, one of the main reasons why I started doing the Obey podcast on my own is because I was so fed up with seeing headlines of stories that didn't matter. And the first time I think I ever was kind of like pushed over the line of being fed up with those is when people are talking about Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump's tax returns, as if any person who is going to vote for either of those people actually cared about their tax returns. And it's one of those things where it's like, in terms of public interest, you could care. In terms of if it's incriminating, you could care, but no voter cared about it. And it was all put in this context of, we're going to argue about policy and conflate it with these people. And then it was obvious to me that there was no progress to be made, and you only got stupider by paying more attention to those types of dialogues. Now I really only pay attention to the news in terms of, I want to be aware of the narratives that are being shaped, because I think a lot of narratives are shaped, play into what people believe and how people will argue for it. And I think that's important to pay attention to. But I totally agree with you that if I go on Twitter, even people I agree with on Twitter are generally toxic. Unless it's like really absurd humor that is kind of based around the ANCAP worldview, which is a niche that does have a lot of people in it. I would say like Pete Quinones and Asarchist, and then everybody on the Timeline Earth podcast. I would say they all fit into that group. And I know I name drop people you're not familiar with, but you can just roll with it for a second. That's like a niche that I can kind of laugh at. But if you go on Twitter and you look at what's trending and why, it's people getting mad about what Tucker Carlson said on a show. And it's like, well, of course, half of the normal, like, I guess, blue-pilled people watching Tucker Carlson clips on Twitter that they disagree with are going to get upset about it, because they find everything Tucker Carlson believes deeply inflammatory. So there's nothing to be gained from paying attention to that fray. For the most part, a lot of it is commentary and then meta commentary about that commentary from people that you don't really care about. Like, how much do you care about Tucker Carlson's opinion? You really shouldn't have to. Now, I think I would take it a step further and say, I was getting annoyed yesterday because Joe Biden had his big speech to the joint session of Congress. And I don't think even that stuff matters. I feel like if you listen to a speech, you might as well be listening to a stump speech on his campaign. I'm sure it tells you what the government might do over the next month, but you could find that out in like a one paragraph, article the next day. And if anything, being aware of it doesn't really change if it's going to happen or not, which is really the most unsettling thing about politics in the United States. Is a lot of times you're seeing this, you're seeing that this low information discussion happening, and you know that if you chime in or you weigh in, to some degree it matters because you're taking a stance and you're informed, and you might be able to persuade some people, but a lot of times the waves keep rolling no matter what you do. um, so that's the really disheartening part, and that's the part that to some degree makes me ask, like, well, why do we care about this stuff? Why do we talk about this stuff? um, and I know we kind of talked about that a little bit yesterday when we were off air, but a lot of it to me isn't about actually changing the way people act. A lot of it is just hoping that if you can reach a few people, you can directionally change them, and you have more people out there who are, I guess, like, I mean, if we're going to keep using the whole blue pill and red pill analogy, though, it's just like if you wake up more people, then even if you're only waking up 5 more people, I think that's still a win, because I think there's a benefit of being aware that a lot of the stuff doesn't matter. And to some degree, it's completely unimportant, and it's presented to us like it matters, and it doesn't. So I think there is value in that to take part of what you said, but I did want to get that out there.
So I think a intuition that I have that I really can't get away from is the idea that thinking about political questions matters. And I say political questions and not politics because I mean, we'll have to talk about it a little bit, but I'm not trying to like get into a long debate about what the word politics means, because I think I would agree with you. You know, whining about what Tucker Carlson said on Twitter is a waste of time. Following party politics or participating in party politics at an intimate level is a waste of time. To some degree, even participating in the mainstream media, you could say, is a waste of time. Although I guess unless you're making the argument that, well, if you're putting your message out there, even if you're on CNN, even if you're on an atrocious channel like CNN, maybe that would be beneficial to some degree. But I mean, I can't really, I don't really see where I'm wrong, I guess, or where in the belief that, you know, it matters. The country's economic policy matters. The country's foreign policy matters. I know, and I can say that's a personal statement. Some people don't care about that stuff, and I can't force them to care. But I can't really get away from that. Those things do matter because they have real world ramifications. The American involvement in Vietnam, for example, it mattered. There was a reason people, you like, what's the point of really taking stances on whether Vietnam was moral or immoral if it didn't matter? It's not really like some thought experiment that has no basis in reality. Now, of course, I guess it goes back to certain values, certain intuitions, and that might lead you to have an opinion of whether the Vietnam War was moral or immoral. But I think it's a question that needs to be asked. But at the same time, like I said, I'm finding it more and more difficult to give opinions, probably because I'm inundated with so much information, and it can be hard to parse out the evidence and find the time to look over certain matters and to come to a thought out conclusion. So that is sort of the weird position I currently find myself in.
So what that sets up like 3 kind of thoughts for me. So I don't necessarily think it's important to think about political questions, and I think that intuition comes down to a similar thing people post themselves, which is like that famous quote: "An unexamined life is not worth living." And a lot of people don't really find it necessary or even share the intuition that they need to think deeply about certain questions. And I don't really think that's a good or bad thing. Now, I think part of the reason why you and I are here is because we do have the intuition to us that we find things unjust or important. So, of course, we're going to spend this time talking about it and researching it and then debating certain principles. Like if I didn't have the intuition that a lot of things government does is deeply unjust, then I probably wouldn't be that interested in politics. I think that's why a lot of people are bored by them, because they're just very indifferent about what's happening. They think, okay, yeah, the government will handle that. I they don't want to dedicate a lot of their time to something they're not that informed about. And a lot of people only have so much capacity. A lot of people have the capacity for doing the things they have to do in their life, and they don't have capacity to think about something in their leisure time. And I don't think that's a good or a bad thing. I'm completely okay with people having those value judgments. And the other thing I'd add is I don't think most people's views are important. If we're talking about Vietnam, for example, I think the people at Berkeley's views ended up mattering a lot because they coordinated it and they made a big statement about Vietnam. And then anytime you watch any documentary about Vietnam, it shows all these protesters at certain colleges. So those people's views mattered a lot. And then the people who were in charge of the war effort, their views mattered a lot because they decided if they were going to cave. But a lot of people, their votes were pretty much meaningless because they weren't the people who were making the culture or the nation's decision, and they weren't directly related to it. Similarly, I would say right now, like when I think about people in the liberty movement, Dave Smith was just on Joe Rogan's podcast, and I think Dave Smith, he's in a place where what he does in the imminent future matters a lot, because Dave Smith's the kind of guy who can get in front of a more normal mainstream audience every now and then. And if he gets three minutes on CNN, he's more likely to red pill, more people than I would, in 7 to 10 months of podcasting. And he's a person who can maybe reach out to people who aren't exposed to this stuff, and he might only wake up like a dozen people in that few minutes, but he's the person who can get in that position to do it. He's the person who can get on Joe Rogan and he can talk about Yemen for 10 minutes. So there are people who are in positions to shift opinion. I just don't think there's a lot of them. So I guess I shy away from saying just because these things are important, it needs to be in the front of anybody's mind. Because even if like I listen to a ton of audiobooks, I like sussing out these issues. I like when my intuition is something is going on that is unnecessary and unjust and it should be remedied. I like to find out more about it, and I like to make sure that I'm comfortable with making that claim. And I like to be able to argue about it. So this information I like having because it's something that strikes me, but it doesn't mean other people should find it important. And it doesn't mean that I have power over it. So the fact that I do it is kind of coincidental because it's something that strikes me. So it's a hobby I'm pursuing. But a lot of people don't have the means to pursue that. And I think that's fine. So I think that's where I start to push back. And I think you'll agree with a lot of that. But in my core essence, I just don't think it's a inherently valuable thing. And I think that's where we start to shift.
So a couple things. One, I sort of consider politics, or rather public policy, I think would be a better way of putting it. I consider public policy to be an extension of morality. Now, again, sure, there are other people who really don't think much about right or wrong, or just kind of take their culture's assumptions of right or wrong to heart and leave it at that. Yes. Again, I'm really focusing more on my own attitudes towards these things rather than making statements about what other people should or should not do. But I'm concerned with moral claims, and so I think by extension, I need to be concerned with public policy. I mean, we've done a couple episodes on, let's say, abortion, and I think that's a debate which is requires thinking about moral questions, and I think quite a bit of political questions do go back to what do you think is right or wrong, what do you think is just and unjust, and whether morality is objective or subjective, it's not really important to me in the context of this conversation. So that's one reason I can't really get away from talking about politics. or don't think I should anyway. And then the other thing, I do think that not being political, I don't know how much you might not like this statement, but I'm going to say it. Not being political is a political statement. I mean, not being political is a political stance. I really don't think you can get away from the politics. You can put it out of your mind. You can refuse to engage, but politics or political debate, political questions, public policy is happening all around you, and it will affect your life at some point in one way or another. Um, and so, eh, again, I don't see how you can ever fully get away from political questions, intellectually speaking. You're just ignoring them, really, is at the end of the day. So.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to get at though is just some people aren't intellectual, and it's not because they're stupid or and I'm not calling them useless, but a lot of people just do their they go to their job, they have their routine, and I say that's not to imply that it's all people who are non-voters or anything like that, but there are some people who could not name, like, so many political facts that seem obvious to us. They wouldn't be able to correctly identify what policies align with certain you know candidates running for office. They wouldn't be able to tell you any of the vice presidents in recent history. That there are things like that a lot of people can't do, because a lot of people just kind of like, will hear something in the news, have a thought about it, but generally don't care and are doing their thing. And then but yeah, I mean, if you have a monolithic federal government in the United States, it is easy to get sucked into um, a lot of political culture. And even if you didn't have a government, you can argue that being okay with that is a political statement, because it does tie into politics. It's just a lot of people don't conceptualize it that way. And I wouldn't want to accidentally intellectualize somebody who is just, you know, they're content with their job and they have like 95 IQ, and they've never thought about the questions in any intellectual way. So I wouldn't want to, I guess, accidentally give them credit for having political views if they're just kind of floating. I just don't think that that's their intent. Maybe I think intent is a role here. Um, and I will say that there are political actions you can do outside of the directly political realm, and that's a lot of what I kind of am looking into, I guess, on my end. Those are things that interest me, because it's easy for me to think about certain leaders in the GOP having a disproportionate amount of power because they can shape the agenda for half the country. But a lot of individuals aren't going to be in positions to where they're the leader of the GOP. And they're not going to be in the positions where they're influencing the top primary candidate in a district of a certain party. So a lot of things that could be technically seen as apolitical, like cryptocurrency and gold and things that are in the financial sector. So some people invest in Bitcoin to get a return because they think it'll be valuable someday. And some people do it because you can use off-system wallets to make transactions that can go unnoticed and the government can't track them in an effective way. So some of these things that are about, you know, transacting with another individual in markets aren't inherently political. Maybe you're just buying something, but it is political because your choice of doing that is to avoid, surveillance or taxes. So, I mean, I will see that a lot of things are political, even if they're not directly political in terms of like GOP. And those things I think are probably the most important on an individual aspect. I would say that's doing those kinds of things is a lot more important than me coming on here and arguing about student loan forgiveness. And I guess the reason is because as much as I can feel strongly about student loan forgiveness and what they should or shouldn't do and what the trade-offs and costs are going to be, it's not actionable. And there are actionable things that people can do when you talk about subverting the government if you don't like the government. And even if people don't want to hear that, or it's not, I don't know if there's a similar thing to lay out on the modern American left. But in ANCAP circles, there are ways to get around it, and those actions are political, because if you do things freely and outside of regulations, it's a political action. So I think that ties in a little bit. So I think I agree with you to some extent. I just don't want to over broaden what political means for the reason that some people are like not intellectuals. So it's kind of a conflating of terms there, but it doesn't matter that much, and I don't want to get bogged down in it.
Well, I'm glad you kind of brought up action because to give an example from my own life, I was I could have when Bernie Sanders, well, he's run twice now for president, and I could have, and I'm someone who considers himself uh, to one degree or another a Bernie Sanders supporter, even if he has disappointed me in recent months. Um, but I didn't do anything to help him really. I mean, I talked to people about him, so I had conversations with people in the hopes that maybe I would bring them to my what I thought was my side of things, or what I think is my side of things. But I didn't do anything. I didn't really help his campaign. I didn't really help him get elected. I didn't go knocking door to door. I didn't volunteer for his campaign to make phone calls. Um, I didn't put up signs. I didn't go to, meetings or protests or anything. Um, so I didn't really, as they say, put my money where my mouth is. I just had an opinion, and I just kind of let the world do its own. I let things run their course without really getting too heavily involved. Um, and I think I regret that because I'm reminded. Everyone knows the whole, Karl Marx quote about philosophers up until now have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. Um, Again, you could say that's an intuition that differs from other people's intuitions, but I think I would share a similar intuition. I think again, if I believe in thinking about moral questions, then I believe in thinking about political questions, and if I believe in thinking about political questions, then I should do something to um, advocate for my side. Um, but that's why I'm again, to tie it back to what I said in the beginning of this conversation. I'm trying to get back to basics, trying to think more about what it is I actually believe, or if I'm just saying things because I've heard other people say them, if I'm just parroting other people's arguments. So I really don't think I can really implement any action until I feel more comfortable in what I believe, because I'm still kind of trying to figure out. I'm at a point where I need to reevaluate what it is I do believe. So, for example, to make this even more, to make this policy specific, I'm having doubts about the left wing take on guns and gun control. Um, but I don't, I still hold by a good bit of what I said in my criticisms of the right's opinions on guns, because I do think people make ridiculously stupid arguments in favor of guns. But I'm not sure that that's that I'm not sure that those ridiculously stupid arguments mean that we should implement gun control in this country. I'm actually coming to a position that might be more similar to the right wing's position on guns, even though I don't want all the baggage associated with that. Um, so that's just one example of something I think I've probably, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say I've completely changed my opinion, but I'm getting to a place which is different from what it was, even when we had that conversation. Um,
Well, I've been through a lot of phases of my political views as certain things sharpened and as I became more aware of other things. So like you wouldn't hear me say anything about imperialism, a few years ago, and it's because it wasn't something I'd researched intently, because it's not something that was happening to me. So I kind of was like, well, I care more about the things that are directly hurting me in the yeah, on domestic soil first, and then after I'm done, you know, after I'm done getting freaked out about all that stuff and why all that stuff's wrong, now I'm going to learn more about this other thing, and then that helped change a lot of my views on certain things. Or all of a sudden you'll wake up because you'll hear a really bad argument by somebody you thought you agreed with, and then you're just like, okay, I'm not sure if I am on this team. And I think that that's why a lot of people this is a growing trend in the United States, is that more people identify as independent. And I think it's just because a lot of our discourse is filled with bad arguments. So even though somebody's intuition might be, I agree with the right wing or the left wing on this issue, when I turn on TV, they're making the stupidest argument. And even I know it's stupid. And if I know it's stupid, then how can I say that I'm like happily, a member of this party and will vote for these people? I think I think that's a lot of what's going on there. But I don't think there's any problem of reevaluating your views. And one of the things that I think, well, this is why I listen to a lot of mainstream right wing and mainstream left wing commentators, is because you have to listen for the bad arguments and you got to listen for the good arguments. And I say all this like this is why I'm inherently against democracy to some extent, is because I put in all this time. I'm fortunate that I listen to so much audio that I speed it up, so I burn through all this content and kind of like in record time on a daily basis. But I've always had jobs where I can sit there and I can listen to all this stuff, and I can think about it, and I can kind of I can sit there and I can hear an argument, and I can meditate on if it's a good argument or a bad argument. And a lot of people can't do that. And if you can't do that and you can't really suss out the differences, it's just crazy that a lot of people have a lot of say over so much of people's lives. And you don't really have any reason to be an informed person and weigh certain things and weigh different arguments and weigh what your values are. And then hear all the counter arguments from all these angles. It's just not a sustainable thing, especially because the issues in the news change every month or so. But I've definitely been in phases where I've strongly questioned my intuitions, and I think that's why when we talk about an issue like guns, I can generally hold my ground in ways that are satisfying to me and hopefully satisfying people who are skeptical of my position, at least sometimes, because so one thing you talked about when you brought up political action is how you weren't out there campaigning for Bernie Sanders, but you signaled your support to other people and you vouched for him and you said, no, I think these ideas are good. So I'm not directly politically active and I'm not campaigning for certain people, but I definitely will say things in order to, at least in my personal life, try to shift the Overton window, at least in the people who I'm close acquaintances with. So a lot of my friends, I've shifted from being right wingers to being people who are more libertarian and cappy type groups, with those types of views, because I will say things that are like, very offensive about cops, right? And stuff like that. And I'm okay with, in my personal life, shifting that Overton window over. And I think to some degree that has an effect, because that's kind of I can control the people who I hang out with in the sense if I pick and choose, I'm not forced to hang out with them. And if they already have some of my sympathies, it's like, well, that's why I hate cops, because if there weren't cops, you'd never have to worry about paying your taxes, because there wouldn't be people to drag you, into jail if you didn't do it. The government has to have the gun guys. So I guess what this whole rambling sentence is getting at is they're just preaching your views to other people who don't necessarily agree with you is important. The reason I brought them up though is to say they share my intuitions, but they wouldn't be able to argue with maybe you on a consequentialist basis, because to them all they care about is their intuition. They're satisfied because it's like, dude, no, I value freedom, and this policy is anti-freedom in my conceptualization of it. But if I'm talking to somebody who doesn't share that intuition, that's not a good enough argument. And a lot of Fox News and CNN is people saying the argument that resonates with the base, but you only have people like the Cato Institute who are willing to say, we're not going to talk about principles. We're going to talk about this policy works. And if you want to get the consequentialist evaluation of statism, you go to the Cato Institute and they tell you why the policy has all these bad consequences. So like, I'm fortunate that I'm read up on that. And I can argue about gun control because I think people should just be allowed to have guns. But I can also argue about why a lot of gun policies don't do what they want to do. And they don't actually achieve their goals. And I think that's why we've done a better job than Fox News has when we've talked about certain policies. So yeah, the point is most people aren't incentivized to go beyond their intuitions, which is fair. But I would say I think that it's just something that has to be reckoned with. I don't think you can change that. And then I'm more comfortable with my political views, but which is something that is fairly obvious. If you're questioning yours like that, that's totally fine. I've questioned mine on a lot of things, and I'll question my views on a lot of policies in like very, I guess, more narrow ways now than before. But I think it's important for me at this point to shift the Overton window. So when I'm talking to people who I know are, people who are amenable to my positions a little bit, it's not my goal to affirm what they're saying. My goal is to push them even more into it. And I want to make it very acceptable to say things like, dude, all this stuff that they're presenting to you doesn't matter at all. And if people are following this stuff like it matters, they're wrong and they have a problem. And yet those people should be looked down upon and stuff like that. And it's like, yeah, is it provocative? Yeah. And it's, but it's in line with things that I argue and I'm comfortable arguing about. But the core of the conversation, being comfortable with your intuitions and your views on issues, is central to that. Because if you're not comfortable with it, then you can't push people in that way. And you can't shift people a little bit on the ends in your personal life. It really comes down to, are you comfortable with the research, and are you comfortable with evaluating something after you've heard from a few sides of an issue? Yeah. Sorry, I rambled a lot longer, but I think I got a lot out there.
I mean, I think you and I have had a slightly different experience with in terms of like the political conversations we've had, because, and I could be wrong on this, but I don't think I've ever convinced anybody about any political position ever. At least I can't think of an opinion, unless I just did and then promptly forgot about it. I can't remember a time when I was talking to someone, they're like, "Oh, you're right, Matthew. You've convinced me that I was wrong." I don't think I've ever had that experience, and maybe I will someday. I probably will. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. I mean, in the sense that anytime when you're talking to people or having arguments, having political discussions, philosophical discussions, what have you, it teaches you how to argue. It teaches you how to refine your points. It teaches you, when you're making logical fallacies. It teaches you how to put things maybe in a way which is both palatable to the audience in certain contexts, but also, true to your principles, true to what you're trying to say. I suppose, though, one could make the argument that my issue, or that the corrective for my kind of struggling, the corrective for what I'm experiencing right now is to double down, because I suppose if I'm more assertive in what I'm saying, or more, if I'm more convinced by what I'm saying, or at least I, kind of act that way when I'm talking to people, that would be a really good way to kind of teach yourself what you actually believe. So you can just, at some level, I'm almost saying, like, you can't necessarily start from the position of I know nothing. Maybe you have to start from a position of, well, I think this is true, and I'm going to defend this as strongly as I can. And then in that process, you might either come to truly believe that, oh no, this is actually, I believe this wholeheartedly, or no, actually, I think that was a miscalculation. But I'm glad I made that miscalculation, because if I hadn't made that miscalculation, I wouldn't have investigated the matter further. Because I mean, another example, I guess, of it. This isn't really necessarily a political topic, but when I first started thinking about, or when I first started questioning religion, obviously I didn't know as much about the subject as I do now, but that would be an example in my agnostic atheism. When I first adopted that position, I'm more convinced by that position the older I get and the more I study it. So that would be an example of position I took when I was a little younger, again, without necessarily having thought it through as much, but then thinking it through later on to see if I'm right, and then coming to the conclusion, yes, I made the right decision. That wouldn't necessarily always be the case, though.
Yeah. So I think,
in other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think, sorry to interrupt, but you can get stuck in skepticism. You can get stuck in the, oh, I don't know, and I'm not going to claim to know because I could be wrong. It's okay to be wrong. In fact, it's good to be wrong, because that's how you learn.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like when I first kind of got into politics, a lot of my views were very flexible because I kind of was hearing a lot of people on the left saying things that I just that they all those things didn't resonate with me at all. And that was all I knew because as you know, I grew up in California, so everything I heard when I was in high school was generally from the left, and all the right wing people I knew. Which I wasn't I was actually in a right wing county, but in public school, I assumed I had no idea I was in a right wing county until probably when I was 19 and already in college, just because it never came up. Because none of the adults, I think all the adults I knew actually voted Republican, but none of them talked about politics. But when I went to high school, they talked about it a bit. And none of the things that seemed overtly political, and I was pretty apolitical then, and all of it didn't really resonate with me. Um, and for whatever reason, I think a lot of it was just intuition based. Um, about like, wait, it wasn't even that they were telling people to live their life. I just couldn't believe the government funded certain things. I was like, why are they taking taxpayer money and doing this? What if some people don't like that's weird. So I was hearing like a lot of a lot of very generic stuff that didn't jive with what I was thinking. So then when I actually got into politics and I had to stand for something instead of standing against something, I was very willing to be wrong because I was really just repeating things that somebody else was saying, but it was the first time anybody said something that I was like, oh, that lines up with how I feel. So a lot of my views have changed as I've just examined things more. But usually, I mean, I was wrong on a lot of things then, and I'm okay with that. It doesn't bother me that I flipped on certain things. I mean, when I was 18, you could cut and dry ask me about abortion, and I was like, dude, kill it. I don't care at all. And it was that simple. So like a lot of things I flipped on, and I think it's good that I doubled down on it because as long as you're not so attached to things you've doubled down on, then it's not a big deal. And I will say a lot of people are not amenable to persuasion in the moment. Um, so if you're arguing with somebody like I've never convinced my dad's mind on things, but there are moments where if you have to truly empathize with their position, because if you don't understand how they've gotten there, you can't talk them out of it. That's why like when I say things about valuing peace and freedom and voluntarism, when I argue with you, it's more to get it on record because I think it's the most important thing. So I need to allude to it. But if I, in any effort to persuade you in conversations, those aren't the things I'm doubling down on. It's me appealing to the actual effectiveness of a policy, or if it actually is, I guess, like maybe if it's actually something that people want. Maybe there are certain reasons you prefer a policy that I don't, but I can still appeal to the things that you care about if I think my policy is right. And when it comes to a lot of liberty-oriented policies, I think in a consequentialist analysis, I think they are better for people. So what it comes down to is like, I think the job's easier for me than it is for you to some degree. Because if anybody has strong intuitions, a lot of times they are either caring oriented or they're freedom oriented. And if I think you can make the carrying argument for every liberty policy that I'm a fan of. So I think I can go both ways. But if you have views on, say, universal health care, it's going to be really hard to convince somebody with strong liberty-oriented intuitions on that policy ever. Because even if you were able to make a consequentialist case for it, they don't care about it. So it is always going to be hard to argue if you can't frame your argument through the lens of somebody else's, in their philosophical prism. Now and this is why when I talk to people in the liberty movement, I get kind of annoyed because this is why I think that the LP should just. I don't really think there's much value in the LP. I think there's a value in co-opting the Republican Party with more libertarian messages. And the only reason I say that is because I know a lot of Republicans, even if they really go into whatever the GOP tells them to think, they have intuitions that are peace and freedom oriented. So you could co-opt that same base for things that are peace and freedom oriented, and they'd be okay with it if the GOP had the will to do it. Because there are people with those intuitions that you could appeal to very easily. But there's no will in that power structure to do that, so it's not viable. But I would say it's more viable than the LP. So I guess what I'm saying is I haven't had that much success, except for when I talk to friends who are essentially ex-Republicans, because I can make the moral argument more consistently about my views than they can for their views. If I'm like, but why do you like cops? Because the cops are going to be the first people to take away your guns if Joe Biden tells them to. Then they are like, they might not flip their mind immediately, but they have to sit there and they have to reckon with the fact that, that back the blue and I hate the government's bad laws. Well, the cops are the one enforcing the bad laws. So it's like sometimes things are so cut and dry. If you can't change their mind, you at least make them have an exception or a doubt that wasn't there before. So I think there is ground to be made on that level. But yeah, a lot of people who are like in college, though, if you go to your college Democrats group and you try to convince them that of X, Y, and Z, it's going to be a lot more challenging, though, because those people are staunch in what they want to argue in that moment. And a lot of times they aren't flexible in the same way that like random friends are that share your intuitions. So it's challenging. Yeah, I don't know if that tangent was too unrelated or not.
I don't think it was too unrelated, but I will focus on a particular part of your tangent, which is, I think it's important to, or I think probably one reason talking about politics is difficult is people strongly identify with their political positions. So people are strongly in favor of universal healthcare or strongly against universal healthcare, but that is like kind of who they are. They are for they are a person who is for universal healthcare or against universal healthcare. But of course, that is, I guess, when you can get into problems, because if your identity is at stake, then you're less likely to be thinking critically. You're less likely to listen to an argument which might be sound, but it disagrees with yours. And I mean, that makes sense from a, I suppose, psychological perspective, because everyone wants their identity validated. And so if you feel like your positions are in your identity and someone disagrees with your positions, then at some level they're disagreeing with your identity. Now, that's not to say that politics isn't personal, or not to say that political positions aren't personal. I think they are, at least to an extent. But I think if you're trying to think about the issues to some degree, you have to try to think about them as impartially as possible, or you have to try to take your emotions or your identity out of it to some extent, or you're not going to really. I think it's going to be less likely. You're going to be less likely to come up with any truth, if you'll pardon the phrase, if you're not open to changing your mind, if you're not open to accepting that this position of yours is not necessarily who you are. You just have this opinion, and you might have a very different opinion in a different context, or if somebody convinces you otherwise. So that's really what I try when I'm talking about politics. I try not to take it personally. I try to think about it almost as an intellectual exercise, just kind of seeing it as a way of examining ways of thinking and how that can apply to, this policy or that policy. And you can never be fully objective, but I don't worry about that, because you can never be fully objective about anything. And like I said, you can't get stuck in skepticism, because if you get stuck in skepticism, well, no one's a full skeptic. That's the thing. So you have to start somewhere. And it doesn't matter to me if something isn't 100% objective. You can come to, as we've talked about, you can come to something that's true enough in certain contexts, in certain fields, if you're willing to search. A lot of people aren't willing to search, but I think if you're as someone like myself who is interested in that search, that is kind of why I talk about the issues. That's why I'm trying to think more about the issues. That's why I'm gonna try to pay attention more to the news like I used to.
So to some degree, okay. So two things. One, I agree with you in terms of my personal ethos is generally I want to be open, I want to be flexible, and I want to be willing to evaluate things that my intuitions might, instinctively, I might instinctively be dismissive of them, but I want to be at least open to hearing things out and weighing them. Now I will say, like, one of the reasons why I don't try to convince people who are, staunch, lifelong Democrats of my views is because I acknowledge that a lot of people are not flexible about their views. And even if I think I have a solid counter argument to appeal to them, they aren't going to be changed because they've been a Democrat for, a voting Democrat for 25 years. That's kind of why I made the point about shifting the over 10 window, is because if I'm talking to my friends and then I'm like, yeah, all those people, you're never going to change their mind. They might as well go screw themselves. I hate those people exist and they control my life. And then that's where I like being, I guess, more provocative, because you can never change those people if they aren't open in any ways. And they have their intuitions, and everything they're going to do, it goes against what I'm going to do and what I think is an authoritarian way. And I think the most I can say is be, I guess, rude in the abstract, or if I'm like, in a vague way referring to them. I'm not going to be rude in person because that's just a bad game theory and makes life more unpleasant. But I do I'm happy to categorize certain groups that aren't reachable as people who are, evil, right? That's why I'm okay with using terms like that. I guess the other thing I wanted to go building off that, though, is the intellectualization of issues is something that I'm hesitant to do. It might not be a way that contradicts what you're laying out, but I guess I always defer to our intuitions, right? So if you and I were going to evaluate a policy, and you could hear Joe Biden explain why it did these good things, and you can list them off, and then you can say, okay, so it did these things, and it cost taxpayers this much money, and this much adds to the debt, and then here are the long-term consequences, and here's how the Congressional Budget Office scored it, and here are all the actual costs of it, and here are all the benefits. And then I'd also wait, like, hey, you have to tax people this much money, and I think taxation is a lot more evil than maybe you do. So no matter how much you intellectualize it, I do think there is like a barrier that cannot be intellectualized. I've argued for my intuitions in a way that I find intellectual. But I do think sometimes telling people like, yeah, but if your policy involves, making it so I can't drive my 1997 car anymore because it'll be illegal, then you can, you can go screw yourself. I think that's like a pretty valid claim if you're talking about the average person. So as much as I do, I guess, like trying to figure out what is optimal in some sort of way of looking for truth, I don't want to look at the forest and overlook the trees, because I do think when people have that intuition that is very not intellectual of just like, but actually, you're going to make something I do that's peaceful itegal, so I hate your guts. It's like, well, that's actually kind of a valid point. And I think intellectualizing things misses that. This is why, I think Stoicism gets a lot of undue praise, is because it's like, well, you have the power to rationalize these emotions in certain ways, and a lot of this decides what is and isn't a problem. But then you can kind of like paint the hypothetical of, if somebody killed your daughter, and the only choices were that person could get off free, but they had a good family and were a good parent otherwise, or you can get vigilante justice. I wouldn't be quick to say like, well, even though killing the guy won't bring your daughter back and it will inflict pain on that guy's family that he actually is good to otherwise, like, I don't think it's that bad if you retaliate there. And somebody might make a rational argument appealing to things like, well, here's why revenge doesn't actually feel that good. And you're not undoing this thing, and you would be taking this from other people. So on the net, it's actually not a benefit to anybody in the situation, really. But then it's like, yeah, but if that guy killed your daughter, maybe you should retaliate anyways. So I guess that's just a broad summary of hesitancy to intellectualize things that maybe aren't, they aren't for intellectualizing. I would stake that out a little bit more than you'd be willing to. So yeah, I feel like that probably triggered you. So
No, I don't think it triggered me because I'm intellectualizing it. But I don't know. So I think I really agree with most of what you're saying. I think we just sort of put it in different ways. Because well, I mean, I told you, or as I said earlier, I mean, politics, I think, is an extension of morality. And as I said, when we talked about kind of objective, subjective morality, I'm not sure that's really a terribly interesting question, or at least I'm not sure that's necessarily the first question we have to ask ourselves when we're discussing morality. I mean, basically, what you're saying is not everything, people aren't wholly rational. I mean, that's definitely 100% true. And the funny thing about when people are, complain about the Enlightenment, everyone thinks, oh, Enlightenment philosophers, were stupid because they thought everyone was rational all the time. But if you actually read the Enlightenment philosophers, that's a caricature of what they said, and it's not honestly engaging with their arguments. So it's not that everything can be intellectualized, but I think it is that with a lot of policy debates, at least if I'm talking to a person, I find it. I don't find it helpful to use moralizing arguments. And I think you would probably, I don't know how you might not defend it in so many words, but I mean, when you talk to me, like you do a podcast with me, and I just said earlier, I was, and basically still am a Bernie Sanders supporter. You could say to me, well, Matthew, that's evil, but you're not going to use that as an argument in favor of your position. You're not going to be like, well, Matthew, you're evil, I'm not going to talk to you, screw off. You actually talk to me like I'm a person to be reckoned with. And so that's, I guess, really what I'm talking about. I mean, that there are certain issues which are, I think, off the table, and that goes back to certain moral presuppositions. I would agree with that. It's just a matter of how I'm willing to phrase certain things when I want to talk to people about particular issues. I mean, obviously, I'm not gonna, if I'm talking to a racist, um, which I have talked to racists on the internet. I don't recommend it, but like I don't, you you can get to a point where it's like, well, no, dude, you're not saying anything. There's no argument there. Go away. I don't want to engage with you at that point. Yeah, so you can find a balance between, talking to people as respectfully as possible while still upholding your principles
Yeah.
and not being a pushover. I don't think those are irreconcilable, and I don't even think we really disagree.
Yeah, so I think one of the nuances I want to carve out is moralizing is good for arguing with people if you're pulling somebody who's like vaguely like quote on your side, more on your side. So if I'm talking to a Republican and they imply that they are very freedom oriented, then I can use the language of their morals to cut against their own views and in favor of my views. Now, if I'm talking to you though, and you don't weigh, I guess, like, the evils of taxation the way that I do. If I'm going to argue with you about the wealth tax, I mean, I can turn to my buddy JT and I can just say like, oh, the wealth tax is evil because I don't see why the government needs to steal more money from people. I don't see why this needs to be double taxed. But if I was going to talk to you, I'd say like, well, did you know like all these countries in Europe had it for about 5 to 10 years and it's actually just not practical because, it's hard to evaluate certain types of wealth in ways that make any sense. And it ends up costing all this money to enforce, and it ends up making all these government subjective evaluations that are kind of sketchy, and a lot of the people found ways to hide their wealth in creative ways so it didn't generate more revenue. So it's like I would make one argument to you, but if I was trying to pull somebody who was a right-winger that was vaguely maybe sympathetic to something, I could pull them more into the libertarian side by using some of their own moral language. That's what I was getting at. But yeah, you have to meet people where they're at, right? It doesn't help to go out and do that. But like if I was talking to my local representative here in Philadelphia, if who's going to run for Congress, I would never try to change his mind. Because I know it's not going to work. He's a guy in his 30s. He's involved in politics. He wants to be a congressman. It's like he sold his soul. He's never going to change his views really on anything unless his party tells him to. So what I would probably do is I'd probably say, If I had the chance to talk to him for a couple minutes, I'd probably tell him he's a disgusting human being and I don't feel represented by him. And if it wasn't illegal to spit on his face, I would, right? Because I think there's more to gain from just giving him absolute disrespect and making him, feel bad about it than there is convincing some people if they're too far gone, right? So, like, that's you're not always trying to convince people, I guess. And if people are beyond convincing, it is good to remind them that in their effort to help people, sometimes they're actually doing things that other people are completely against and they're actually hurting people. And you don't always have to meet them in a way that isn't on an intellectual basis, especially if they're people who are never going to change their mind. Which is like if you had the chance to talk to George W. Bush when he was president, it's like, well, were you really going to try to talk him out of something in a rational way, or did you know that whatever you said, Dick Cheney would tell him the counterpoint and he'd ignore you? It's like no, you'd probably just say, dude, you're evil. I hope you know you're evil, and I hope half America thinks you're evil, and you should feel bad about it. And I hope you can't sleep because you're a war criminal. Like that. If I got to talk to George W. Bush, I'd much rather say that than give him pseudo respect and try to amicably talk him out of a position he'll never change. So that's kind of ever present in my mind. I know that's not productive and intellectual, but it's just, I think it's more valuable and it feels better, and it's not directly throwing my time in the trash. At least it's catharsis. Yeah, but I think I've beaten that horse dead, and I think we covered a lot in this conversation. Do you want to give some closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I guess I want to, in closing, I want to cite Jonathan Haidt, or just say a little bit about something he's argued to kind of tie a bow on this, on what we're presenting here. Of course, Jonathan Haidt, he wrote. You probably know the book title. I don't remember the book title actually, but
he wrote two books. He wrote The Righteous Mind, and then he co-wrote The Coddling of the American Mind. But I think what you're going to cite is from The Righteous Mind.
The Righteous Mind, yes. Where basically he lays out a lot of information in support of the idea that people's political and religious views derive from their personality. And so I guess I was going to say, to some degree, maybe when we're talking about how we're interacting with people or whether we're intellectualizing, I can't help but wonder if maybe that's just a difference of personality between us rather than a really thought through argument. Not that I'm trying to diminish either of our positions. There's nothing wrong. People have different personalities, and that's fine. And that's not good or bad. It just it is what it is. But to as much a degree as possible, I guess I want to, as I said, I'm trying to. I guess the reason I might intellectualize it is because, I mean, I have certain, personality traits or quirks, and that might lead me into a certain direction, but that's not necessarily where the direction I should go in. I mean, and personality wise, actually, I think if Jonathan Haidt were to like deconstruct my personality, I think my personality is fairly conservative, to be honest with you. And I don't know if that comes off in the podcast. Maybe it doesn't. But I would say in my habits and whatnot, I would say I have a more conservative personality. But of course, a lot of the opinions I've spouted are more left wing. But I do think one thing that I am trying to work on is to, and this is sort of a personality trait of a lot of like liberals, a lot of like kind of mainstream Democrats. They the kind of stereotype is like they're these people, these meek-minded or these kind of weak-minded people that are just trying to get along with everybody, and they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. They don't want to provoke people. They're just trying to be nice to everybody and get along with everybody. And of course, there's a fatal flaw in that kind of that personality or that worldview, insofar as you can't always be nice to everybody. You can't always get along with everybody. You can't always be diplomatic. And so I think when I'm going forward, when I engage with politics, I think I want to aim off and away from that attitude, which I've been inclined to. I would say, it. I was gonna. There's an Oscar Wilde quote, but I just can't remember off the top of my head. I'm so sorry. But point being, at some level, I guess I say I'm trying to say I admire sort of your attitude in that matter, and I think I want to implement certain. I want to behave in that way more effectively, or I want to behave in that way because I think it is more effective. Just so in the end, I guess like I'm just I'm glad we do this podcast, and I'm glad I have a lot of conversations, political, philosophical, and economic conversations with people. Well, less economic conversations, but I'm glad I have these kinds of conversations because I think it has helped me think through issues more, which is probably why I'm kind of going through a more questioning stage. And as we said, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It's okay to be wrong. Um, all I can say is I hope to have more conversations in the future, and we'll see where it goes. Maybe 2 years from now, I'll be a Buckleyite. We'll see.
Yeah, and obviously I like talking about this stuff, and I think it's fun to talk about, and I think it always at the least it expands, I guess, either awareness of how other people think about things, or it expands the knowledge on the issue, even if we end up disagreeing a lot of the time, anyways. And I think there is, in some ways, stuff to gain from talking about politics with at least certain people.
I
So
remember that Oscar Wilde quote, by the way. I just wanted to throw this out there to help me complete my argument. Oscar Wilde said, "A gentleman is never rude except on purpose." So what I'm saying is, I want to be more like a gentleman in that I want to be rude on purpose.
there you go. That's actually pretty good, and that's how I feel about a lot of politics. Is it's like I don't accidentally say bad things about Janet Yellen. It's never a faux pas. It's always no, like these are the people that I think are bloodthirsty monsters, and I'm okay with calling them that if I've reasoned it with myself. But okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed our investigation, I guess, into the value of politics and thinking about issues and thinking about who is reachable on certain things. We covered it with broad strokes, but I think there's a lot of applications, especially to people who are thinking about discourse and I guess I think about in the liberty movement, but anybody who's in their own in any type of party structure or wants to push ideas, there is certain food for thoughts of ways to attack that. And it's really funny because that's why so many people in like the Mises caucus, who are my favorite political commentators because I agree with them the most, a lot of them aren't sympathetic to the Cato Institute. But the reason why is because the Cato Institute argues about things in a very consequentialist, analytical way. And sometimes that's helpful, in terms of if I'm talking to somebody and that's the only way to reach them. But sometimes you should just be like the Mises caucus and say like, no, why should the government do that? That doesn't help very much. And this is violent. Violence is bad. But if you want to hear more of our content, we have our backlog of more than 50 episodes on all sorts of things. We have more investigations in our political intuitions arguing about that. We've covered all sorts of policy or other types of debates, like like how I referenced the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris debates. We've gone through those and argued about those and had fun there. I do a solo show called the Obey Podcast where I do investigations into a lot of stuff that's more topical in the news. I was sick last week, so I've been a little behind on doing that, but there is stuff that I imminently want to cover once I carve out some time to do that. Because there are little things going on under the radar once you get past the garbage Tucker Carlson conversations that are not worth talking about. There is stuff to talk about, like Turkey criminalizing the use of Bitcoin for certain types of transactions, that it's like, hey, there are certain things on the horizon that should be watched out for. You can find more Matt stuff on his YouTube channel, The Anti-Philosopher, where he talks about certain books he reads. He talks about certain things that are, at the front of his mind, and he vlogs. He does all sorts of stuff, and you can find his content there. He's been posting more lately, especially in the last few months compared to historically. So he's got a lot of stuff there that you can check out. But signing off until next week when we argue about more stuff. It's Matt. Thank you.